Welcome to Collab Conversations, the podcast where impactful discussions serve as catalysts for change. I'm your host, Sabrina Hanna, and this podcast is dedicated to advocacy and the individuals driving positive transformations in the Canadian healthcare landscape. And I've got with me today Ranita and Kathryn from Nested Knowledge, and I will let both of you introduce yourselves and then maybe tell us a little bit more about what you do at Nested Knowledge.
Hi, I'm Kathryn Cowie. I work in business operations at Nested Knowledge. That involves handling budgets and billing, as well as building data pipelines for internal business data. I'm also a patient advocate with the Every Life Foundation's youth chapter called the Young Adult Rare Representatives, also known as YAR. We've done federal advocacy. I'm a patient with a rare mitochondrial disorder.
I'm Ranita Tarchand. I'm the scientific director here at Nested Knowledge. I work primarily with our clients, so pharma companies, contract research organizations, academics, regulatory bodies, institutions on implementing the software into their evidence synthesis workflow. This can be engaging in HTA submissions. This could be systematic literature reviews, gap analyses, anything to do with the evidence. That's really what we are working with here at Nested Knowledge.
Great. So actually, I've got you both on here because Kathryn, I read an article that you had posted just before ISPOR. And I mean, I think patient centricity is a topic that I've been talking a lot about this year, but I feel like while we're talking a lot about patient centricity in healthcare as a whole, we're not really focusing on HTA, at least not in Canada. We haven't really focused the discussion on HTA or health technology assessment. And so that article really, really piqued my interest. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that article?
Yes, and first I'll give a little bit of context. So Nested Knowledge is a software for literature reviews and evidence synthesis that's often used to create health technology assessments. And I was, outside of work doing advocacy with the foundation that I mentioned, and had a moment where I realized that there was an opportunity to reflect and take my advocacy that I was doing separately and apply it to what we're building at Nested Knowledge, what we're working on. I joined a conference focused on the methods around patient-centered HTA in DC, and based on that, wrote up the blog post noting that when building a patient HTA, we've got a lot of organizations that have identified it as a goal, and there's some publications offering some guidance, but there's really not much consensus around what it looks like, how to measure it, how to implement it. And there's even some controversy over whether it's realistic and whether it supports the goals of patients. So that's certainly something I want to explore. And I think Nested Knowledge is in a good position to be a leader in this space.
Yeah, so maybe just tell me a little bit more about why wouldn't it be realistic to explore?
So there's a moment at the conference that was a bit dramatic. There was an economist sitting on a panel, and if you don't know a lot of economists, they can be sharp people, I would say, very direct, very detailed. And this economist noted that health technology assessments are often used by health insurers to deny coverage of certain treatments. They deem these treatments not cost effectiveness, and that leads to coverage being denied, which of course would be at surface level would be against patient interest. Now, the reality is a bit more complicated. Having effective resource allocation certainly benefits everyone in healthcare, but the economist pointed out that it's a little bit awkward to ask patients to contribute to an HTA that ends up concluding that this drug is not cost effective, even if it's a drug that could potentially help them.
Okay, that's really interesting. Ranita, I don't know if you want to add anything in here, but I've got a question. So if you want to add anything, and I'll hold off on my question.
No, that's okay. You can go ahead with your question. I'm also going to mention I am an economist and an epidemiologist by training, so I'm going to be coming with that perspective, and also from the perspective of some of our clients that are actually doing these HTA submissions and submitting to regulatory bodies for that reimbursement piece. So this is really interesting to hear, at least from that perspective, because I completely agree that is very accurate depiction of kind of what we are doing day to day, and how we kind of interpret questions of value as we go about crafting those submissions.
Yeah. So when I think about a patient-centric HTA, I think about not just providing input into the process, but like a whole process that is built with patients. And so patients and caregivers. So, I mean, if you take the example of women's health, you can't build women's health without including women in building that. So when you think about patient-centric HTA, and Kathryn, I think you and I talked about it offline last week. So when you're thinking about it, are you thinking about it as patient-centered HTA? Or are you thinking about it as patient-centric? Is there a difference? And like, that's not even my question. My question is really like, HTA in a country like Canada is about cost effectiveness because the government pays for drugs and they can't pay for everything. Patients also don't want to have access to everything. They want to have access to something that is going to be appropriate for them. Is like it's going to reduce their side effects. It's going to increase their survival, their quality of life, like whatever preferences they have for their treatment trajectory is what they're looking for. And so maybe it's because we're used to being in a space where we're already doing a lot of this resource allocation, and so we're okay with some drugs being denied and some being approved. So, like, I don't agree that, like, from the economist perspective, that patients, like, how can you expect them to be on board? And maybe it's because I'm coming from the Canadian landscape where, like, this is just the way it is. So, I mean, this like a lot of things to say what I just said, but I would like your feedback on all of that.
Yeah, I can jump in. So what I'm going to mention is that if we look at CADIF and we look at NICE, so the UK and Canada, you're absolutely correct, Sabrina. They are focused on cost effectiveness. It's actually very well known from the academic perspective and then also from the industry perspective that when you're submitting to CADIF and when you're submitting to NICE, that's essentially what you're doing. You're really looking at the economic data, you're looking at the clinical data and trying to establish a comparison, clinical comparative effectiveness of what the standard of treatment versus the intervention that's trying to be put on the market or expanded for an indication. And you may be doing epidemiological data, so burden of illness review. I would say that burden of illness review, it does sometimes have like that humanistic impact portion of it where they're looking at quality of life data. But when we look at the overall HTA process, you're not incorporating almost anything to do with patient engagement. What you may be doing is looking at patient insight data. So you might be looking at, for example, like qualitative information. You might be looking at some survey data. You might be looking at some patient reported outcomes, but nowhere in that process are you going to see really a place for that patient engagement piece, which I think is one of the big umbrellas that is missing from the process in general. What am I thinking is contributing to that? I think it's hard to quantify. For example, like that patient engagement piece, like testimonials, that's hard to put into a very rigid submission that kind of has to hit all these different standards for the regulatory body to say, okay, this thing should be put on the market. It is safe to be put in the human body. It is cost effective, and there is a need for it when looking at the epidemiology of the disease. But when we look at the humanistic impact, that is really the piece that is just secondary to all of this, even though that is really where the application lies, the real world, the reality of okay, we've put this intervention on the market, it's being sold, but how is it actually being used? What sort of impact is it having on, the day-to-day life of a patient? So that's just to say, Sabrina, yeah, there is a gap here. How do we address it? That's something I'm not really sure of, but I think starting with humanistic impact and burden of illness reviews is a good place to start. That's certainly where you do see some engagement in the industry starting off just right off the bat.
Yeah, and so you mentioned this just before we started recording about not all HTA requires the humanistic review. And so if it's not required, why bother doing it?
Yeah, that's a good
like, well, you said it, so I won't take credit for it. You said it. But so how do you get that humanistic piece into HTA? So like it is required and we do, like the manufacturers need to start thinking about
It starts with the regulatory body. So, CADIT and NICE, they come out with guidelines all the time. We can also mention the Joint Clinical Assessment here as well. So,
Yes.
they put out guidelines. They update the regulations all the time on what should be going into these reports. You have to imagine this is relatively new. Not so new that it's never been heard of before, but it's definitely new enough that it's not a rigid requirement that these pharmaceutical companies or medical device have to actually address when they're going through submission. So when I'm looking at this process, that is a good place to start, is requiring a review of that humanistic impact data rather than just saying, okay, as long as we've got a burden of illness and we've got some sort of epidemiological reporting, that's good enough. I would say it's not good enough, especially when we're talking about illnesses like cancer, rare diseases, drugs that have a just a rigorous impact on the patient and their entire livelihood, not just some portion of their being. So
Yeah. And going back to the patient engagement piece, Kathryn, I had shared with you a blog post that if Pia had put together, and it was on, so they had asked the HTAI patient and citizen involvement interest group to do a review of all the HTAs. And so what they found, while patients can be involved in every step of the HTA process, no example was found where patients were consistently involved in all steps in one country. And across all countries, there was little consistency in how patients were involved or how their input was used in the HTA report. So just going back to that comment that you made about patient engagement, which I think is a part of a patient-centric approach to HTA, but not the full picture, but just like that statement in 2024 where we can't even get all the HTA to do what is necessary for the patient engagement piece.
Yeah, that is a challenge. And another related challenge with that is that patients are diverse and have very diverse experiences, even within the same disease. And that's really hard for institutions that are trying to engage patients to fully capture. In the rare disease world, I think about 3 to 4% of rare diseases have a drug available that treats the disease. And if you look at advocacy groups, if you look at people who can show up to meetings, people who can fly on planes, people who can meet with drug companies, those are disproportionately the patients that have the treatments, that have the resources, that can travel for healthcare. So you have this extra challenge of, it's already hard to engage patients to begin with, and then it's also hard to engage them without biasing some voices.
Yeah. And so do you think that it's different for the rare disease space versus like cancer, for example? Like, so should the HTA processes, I know in Canada, at one point we had a review for the non-oncology drugs, and then we had a process for the oncology drugs. But when they're doing a HTA review and it's a rare disease versus cancer, for example, should they be looking at that differently?
Absolutely. And one of the differences is, with a broader disease that affects more people, patients can be engaged to design outcome selection and to help plan protocols for large studies, for large literature reviews, and different ways of synthesizing existing evidence. Whereas in rare spaces, you need patients to build the data. You need patients to meet with other patients and build registries from the ground up. So there's a very wide difference in data availability, which impacts the methods of HTA.
Yeah. And so how does AI help in all of this? Ranita, I see you smiling.
I have to
You
smile
love the
because
question.
yes, I love the question. I love any discussion of AI in the HTA process, just because, I have to mention again, this is such a new patient engagement one, and patient centricity is new in the industry. And then we have this wild card, AI, coming on the scene as well. And you can imagine a lot of firms are trying to incorporate AI in their evidence strategy for going about these different geographical submissions. Okay. So on one hand, one thing to think about that evidence strategy is where can you incorporate patient engagement in like the scientific advisory that happens. And this is talking about clinical trial development. This is also talking about trying to incorporate the insights from maybe horizon scanning or maybe some surveys that have gone out, when you're thinking about, okay, what geographies are we going to be submitting to, what sort of evidence are we planning to incorporate when we're going towards commercialization post phase 3. And you can imagine, maybe that's not top of mind for a lot of these firms. What's top of mind for a lot of these firms is how can we get this submission through as fast as possible with some sort of sustainable effort that's being made, because you can imagine this evidence is going to go out to date like that. As soon as you're through phase 2, going into phase 3, well, okay, new evidence has emerged. We've got to update this thing again. Same thing going from phase 3 into commercialization. You got to update that thing again, and it is an exorbitant cost to the industry, really to anybody that's involved. So when we look at AI, I'm gonna answer this from that same sort of patient based evidence and insights first. A lot of that information is qualitative. It's also really hard to find for for certain disease spaces. So I can understand why for like a contract research organization or pharma company, when they're doing that epidemiological review, it's real easy to say, okay, well, we've got some registry data. We know how many people have this disease. We know the incidence. We know the prevalence. That's really easy to do, for a review. What's hard to do is kind of identify variables and the pico characteristics that you can then evaluate for something like a humanistic burden review. And this information is qualitative. And I will say AIs, they do qualitative very well. And I'll specify here, especially GPTs, they can go into the data, they can extract information, and they can say, okay, well, these are themes that are being mentioned across these humanistic impact studies, across these, qualitative surveys that are being done. That is really key in being able to incorporate that data, because all of a sudden it's not this really intensive burden that the researchers have to go in and really read the literature and scan and try to synthesize. You can get a very broad overview on these studies on what those key themes are, which kind of makes it a little bit easier to communicate for that dossier that's being delivered.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I feel like a lot of the things that we hear is because it's qualitative data, it's hard for it to actually be measured, or like you can't. So with CADIF now, CDA, the Canadian Drug Agency, they have 4 value assessments that they use when they, or 4 criteria that they use when they do their value assessment. And so patient value is one of them. But they're not able to tell us, well, in the cost effectiveness, This is like 25% of the value assessment, the patient value is 25%. They can't give us like this quantitative number on how that patient input is being used. So when you talk about qualitative data, which, this is all like anecdotal and subjective, and well, I don't think that it is anymore, because I think the patient groups here are pretty sophisticated, and when they're asking their patients the questions in their surveys, they're getting some really good data that are being used to inform those patient submissions into the HTA process. But when you talk about qualitative data and AI and how like they can read that humanistic factor, like this is big. This could potentially change, like the way that they're doing the reviews, and they could actually say to us, well, the patient value is now 25% of the criteria for the reviews.
Absolutely, Sabrina. And it's a better use case than if you're looking at something like trying to do that clinical comparative effective piece. That is real tough for any sort of GPT to go in, simply because they don't really know how to do math. They struggle right now with quantitative assessments. Sure, there is automations to be had in network meta-analysis, but when it comes to extracting that data and then synthesizing it, you know, GPTs have come very far in that qualitative piece, and there's still ways to go for the quantitative extraction and the synthesis of that, just because, we are dealing with lots of different values. We're talking about ICERs and dailies and analyses that are kind of different across studies. It really does require a human analyst to go in and, introduce standardization to be able to produce that underlying cost-effective analysis or that network meta-analysis for the clinical comparative effectiveness piece. But for something like themes, for patient insights, really a really nice use case for an AI to go in and be able to synthesize that. And I think that does take some burden off of the researcher, because now all of a sudden they're not saying, okay, well, why do we have to, make this argument that there is a humanistic burden? They're saying, okay, we know there's a humanistic burden. Here's the evidence. This is how many times a theme is being reported in, this many studies. So that's really key in, pushing this forward and getting it off the ground for not just the HTA agencies, but also the industry at large.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like, and you and I had this discussion already, Ranita, but I feel like there's also an opportunity for the patient groups to be utilizing this to do their patient submissions.
Yeah, this is something that's really exciting to me, because I had mentioned horizon scanning. I might have also mentioned gap analysis, and sort of a scoping of the literature. I think those are all things that are really good use cases. If I'm going to talk about my clientele, they are very apprehensive towards AI for the HTA itself, because this is a really rigid document. It has some of the highest standards for evidence synthesis that you're going to see. I think the only thing that may have a higher standard than an SLR for HTA is one that's contributing to a clinical guideline, development. So, in terms of that, when we're looking at research designs that don't have that stringent requirement that it needs to have dual screening and it needs to be done in this certain way, something like scoping review or horizon analysis, or just a qualitative synthesis of testimonials of what patients are saying or survey data. This is a really good use case to be able to identify themes, and key variables and their frequency of reporting.
Yeah. You also talked about when you've got the updated data from the phase 2 to the phase 3 or whatever it is, you've got updated data.
Yeah.
So this is something we don't do well here at all, is the rolling reviews, which is the term we use here. So how does that work into this, where like, especially, not only we don't do the rolling reviews well, like there's a lot of uncertainty with the phase 2 in our HTA. Well, CDA requires, well, they prefer phase 3 data, which isn't always possible, especially when we're looking at how segmented, especially in cancer now, with the genetic or the genomic mutations, like these populations of patients are getting smaller and smaller. And so it's not always feasible to have that phase 3 study, but there is like that real world evidence piece and like a lot of updated data that's coming in. So how does that all play into providing that, like, I guess it's not necessarily real time, but it's still pretty quick at providing this updated data?
Yeah, this is I'm going to say this for every question you ask, Serena, because it's so relevant, but I love this question. Here's the thing. AI is big in the industry right now, and it should be. This is going to be one of the biggest things that reduces the cost of what it takes to create this systematic literature review. But when we're talking about living evidence, this is really the nut to crack when it comes to nailing down a sustainable process for evidence synthesis. These reviews, like you mentioned, whether it's in phase 2 or if it's in phase 3, it is going to be out of date, especially for something like cancer, especially for something like rare disease, where new evidence is emerging all the time. We see this turn towards living evidence following COVID-19 and the need for rapid reviews that came out during 2020. We didn't know what we didn't know, and
Yeah.
evidence was emerging and it was coming out all the time, which means the process needed to be living as well. I'll say here at Nested Knowledge, this is our bread and butter. This is what we do. You can think of when you're conducting a review in Nested Knowledge, you are really creating a database of the evidence. The process is made to be sustainable so that you're able to run that search on a schedule and then go in, extract the information, update the review, update the network meta-analysis, rather than just have this in a one-off Excel spreadsheet that goes on a company hard drive and then, withers away until somebody has to dig it up and say, okay, well, back to the drawing board. We have to start this from scratch. You can imagine every time they go back to the drawing board, it's another, $150,000, maybe even more, to continually keep on trying to update, keep the analysis updated. So, why not just get a sustainable process from the beginning where you're able to synthesize the evidence, and just update the new studies, appraise them as you did the old ones, and then produce that final deliverable without having to start from scratch and go back to the drawing board.
And Kathryn, you and I, when we chatted last week, not that we had a debate, but we were talking about patient-centered versus patient-centric. And for me, these are two different concepts. But I just want to know your perspective on patient-centered versus patient-centric.
Sure. So admittedly, I often don't think about it and use the terms interchangeably. But when I do think about it, I see patient-centered as kind of a broader, less rigid term, and patient-centric as implying that patients are the number one priority. My hot take, though, is that there's a quote from the Pixar movie, The Incredibles, where one superhero kid says, if everyone's special, no one is. If everyone's patient-centric, or if everyone claims to be patient-centric, then we don't have a good idea of who's really putting patients number one. And I can see that hospitals and clinics should be patient-centric. Patients are, what they're working for. But to call payers patient-centric might be misleading. It might be less useful for patients to distinguish. I still don't think it should be their goal to be patient-centered and to include those voices, but I don't know that a world where everyone is patient-centric, or everyone claims to be, would be great unless their actions always reflected that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are saying that they're patient-centric, but they're actually not. And maybe it's because there's a little bit of confusion around what it actually means to be patient-centric versus patient-centered. So hospitals obviously are patient-centered because it's their like It's their business. Patients are their business. But are they patient-centric? In my opinion, they could probably do a lot to improve to be patient-centric. And so when I think about patient-centric HTA, I'm not just thinking about like how our patient preferences or patient values incorporated into the submission. I'm thinking about how our patient preferences and values and needs and wants and patients and caregivers, how are they incorporated into the organization? And so I like just from my experience with the Canadian Drug Agency, for example. Um, so, in terms of being patient-centric, then they would have to improve their transparency. Or like, when they're doing consultations with their stakeholders, there's actually no process for like, how did my input or my feedback into this process um, change affect, like there's no two-way communication with our agency. It's very one-way communication. And so like the transparency, the communication, how like when they're implementing these new processes, are they building them because this is going to benefit all the stakeholders, or it's going to benefit their clients, which are the payers? So when I think about patients and a patient-centric approach, I'm thinking about how is this built in a way that it's providing value, not just to the payers, but to the patients who, at the end of the day, are the ones who need to have access to these medicines.
In the US, there's been an issue with the FDA. The FDA will accept patient-reported outcomes from drug companies and other related patient metrics, but then doesn't disclose how they use those patient-reported outcomes. So one of the bills we've advocated for, I think, is called the Benefit Act, which would require the FDA to disclose to patients and to industry how they're using patient-reported outcomes in their analyses.
That's good to know. Ranita, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a great view. I think I'll just mention this is part of like that health system strengthening piece. As always, I have to mention here that we are lucky to live in countries that do have developed HTA processes. I mean, CADIF is one of the leaders in terms of like regulatory agencies and HTA bodies. Same thing with NICE. They have the strictest standards of any HTA body, and they many countries look to them as being like, a guiding light in the HTA process. But I have to mention here, developing countries and health system strengthening throughout. Like I mentioned, we're lucky to live in countries that have developed processes. And as there are countries, I'll mention like Thailand, India, even France, that are now coming in and developing HTA processes, there is a great opportunity to kind of implement some of this very early on. I mentioned scientific advising early on in the process. That's definitely an avenue for patient engagement and kind of crafting this patient centric approach right from the get-go, right from the beginning. All the way through to submission. So I'll just mention that.
And there's been a lot of, so PROs are like the big thing now. And I feel like patient experience data is also like becoming a buzzword. And Kathryn, you and I were talking about it. Like I don't really know what the difference is between PROs and patient experience data. And like, so for me, I feel like patient experience data is not qualitative, but it's patient experience. It's basically what we do as patient advocates when we go into the HTA process to provide our submissions. We're providing that patient experience piece. But now when they're talking about patient experience data, I feel like they're kind of moving away from that actual experience, and they're making it like a a metric, which is great because we need to have a metric, but is it actually going to capture like the patient experience? Are the PROs actually capturing patient-centered outcomes? Are they are they just academic terms, and are they providing like the value that patients actually need into the HTA process? And is anybody using the PROs in the HTA at this moment?
I think there's some good incentives, at least in the US, to take PROs seriously. The non-official regulatory body, ICER, requires drug companies to submit information that captures value, outside of safety and efficacy, and they're getting, pretty broad and innovative in the kind of information they ask for. For example, one new measure of value that's popped up is the value of hope. So qualitative data from patients might capture whether a new drug improves that patient's hope for the future, which historically has been like a difficult thing to discern, and something that certainly wasn't considered in cost-effective analysis. But now there's movement to capture those broader societal values that I think is exciting. And because these watchdog organizations care about them, drug companies are moving towards gathering useful PROs.
Yeah. And how do we get HTAs to be comfortable to analyze this data?
Oh, I can talk about that a little bit. So I think for the most part, PROs in the HTA process right now are helping pharma companies make an argument that there is a burden of illness. That is how I have seen at least HTA submissions leveraging that. It's essentially to make an argument that yes, there is a humanistic burden. Yes, there is there's a need for this drug to be put on the market or to have an indication expansion. And when we're talking about metrics, the HRQOL is an easy one to kind of synthesize because you may be able to find studies that report that. Whereas, other patient reported outcomes or, patient survey data, that might be harder to kind of standardize and synthesize across lots of different studies. And so, it's almost like a low hanging fruit to be able to add in and say, okay, well, there's a need for this. There's a burden. People are suffering. And here are the metrics to prove that. So I think that's kind of how it's being used. Is there a better way? I'm not entirely sure. I think it depends on some of the academics, some of the studies that are being done, even the HRQOL, like the questionnaires that are being done. Some of them are not standardized, so that makes an analysis very hard. And of course, we do need some sort of analysis to take place to be able to make that argument and present it quantitatively to a regulatory body. So that's a pretty tough question for in a field that is getting off the ground and just emerging, but it is one that's necessary to answer.
Yeah. Well, you talked about the HRQOL not being standardized, but there's also been some debate about whether it's actually capturing the quality of life inputs that are important to patients.
That is the thing too. So, I mean, we're looking at a quality of life questionnaire that's really talking about suffering and, and how they're feeling. It's not really about what their experience was or, what was their ease of actually having access to that treatment or, what was their experience when they were in the hospital or when they were trying to, attain the treatment. These are all things that are not really talked about in the HRQOL scale or the questionnaire, and it's a huge gap. I think this is what really differentiates that that kind of patient experience piece versus patient reported outcomes because it's not really addressing we don't really have a good metric to address that patient experience piece because when we're looking at that, we're looking at a process of attaining healthcare. We're not looking at the end result, which is what the HRQOL is really aimed at.
Yeah. And Kathryn, I think you talked about the value of hope, which I think is from the ISPOR value flower. Do you wanna elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think that was actually partially developed by a man who's on the board at Nested Knowledge, an economist, Thomas Phillipson. I mean, he's published a bit about it. I don't know a ton, but I believe the concept is that, especially for patients with terminal illness and devastating diseases, and for caregivers as well, who are stakeholders, feeling hope associated with the treatment, or feeling that you could get better, carries as much value as, say, reducing the adverse event of a stomach ache. In cases, sometimes that's far more value depending on the disease space and depending on the patient.
And so do you think that so when HTA is looking at, or they're doing the review process, I think a lot of it is about the uncertainty with the data. Do you think that value of hope, or any of the value pieces from that value flower, do they help reduce that uncertainty?
I think so. I would have to review the economic methods in more detail.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like as an advocate, if you're providing that evidence from the patient perspective and it's saying, very subjectively that this has helped me go back to work. It's given me like back my sense of purpose. I'm able to do the activities that I was able to do before. Like it's just as important as the ICERs or the quality metrics or the cost effectiveness or the cost benefit metrics that they're looking at. For me, the difference is when you're looking at it like budget impact at the moment versus budget impact long term. Like you're not taking all those other things into consideration when you're doing that HTA review. And so it like I don't know why they do that. I mean, I feel like if like the CAR-Ts, for example, like it's 450,000, let's say, to give this medicine to somebody, but in the long term, you're also reducing the patient's use of the emergency room, of other healthcare professionals. They're going back to work, and so we're missing all those pieces from that HTA review.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing that really is there to address any sort of information on that is the HRQOL, because that'll factor in things like the physical, the mental health, like the activities of daily living, like that sort of thing. But again, we know that the information there is scarce at best. We may not have enough evidence to sufficiently say like what is the um, actual conclusion that we can base this off of. It might not be standardized because they use different sorts of questionnaires that don't have standardized ways to synthesize them. So it's a really tough question, and it's certainly not one that a daily or a quality answers very well, based on just that disability weight that's being used. So yeah, it's a big debate in the industry right now, and it should be because there has to be a better metric out there. It just has not quite been cracked yet on that front.
Yeah. And so I'm just looking at the time just to like start to end the conversation. From your perspective, from your experience, from nested knowledge perspective, what are some of the metrics or indicators that are going to be the most meaningful to apply this patient-centric approach to HTA?
To me, Ranita talked a lot about AI nested knowledge and what that looks like. So we keep a human in the loop, but we use AI to reduce repetitive tasks. And evidence synthesis it can get boring at times. There's a lot of clinical trials, and I see AI as an opportunity to allow these leaders to not worry about the tedious work and then have room for the human work. When AI takes care of screening papers, people can take care of other people, and they can be creative and they can, innovate and find new ways to be patient-centric. So that's, the area that excites me most with patient-centered HTA.
That is beautifully put, Kathryn. And I'm gonna actually jump on your train of thinking here, because let's take a look at for a second the types of reviews that are being done for the HTA. You've got that clinical comparative effectiveness, which doesn't really leave a lot of room for creative research design. It's pretty strict on what they're what they're evaluating, and in terms of like safety and efficacy and comparisons to other drugs. We've got our our review on economics and the cost effective analysis. Same thing, it has pretty strict rules on how you're doing that analysis. But when we are looking at the epidemiological review and the humanistic burden, that leaves room for creative design. It inherently has to, because you're looking at all sorts of real world evidence. You're looking at claims data. You might be looking at registries, and you're certainly looking at HR QOL questionnaires. And when you are trying to kind of maybe use an AI to compute some of the themes that are going through, or you're automating a search to be able to see what's the new evidence that's emerging, it does allow the researcher to gain insights that is going to translate into the HTA to be able to make a more patient-centered argument, rather than just hit all the check boxes that are needed to get the submission out the door. The HTA bodies themselves are starting to pay way more attention to this. If they are lagging on that burden of illness review or that humanistic impact, they will be redlined for it, and they should be. So that's just my 2 cents. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having us. It's been a real pleasure, and just a necessary conversation that I'm honored to be part of.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time, both of you, to be on today. And I'll leave you the final word. If there's anything that Nested Knowledge is working on that you're super excited about, you want to share with the viewers.
Yeah, I will mention, so earlier in the conversation, I mentioned that quantitative extraction has not quite been cracked yet. At Nested Knowledge, you can expect that it's one of our biggest development efforts to crack that quantitative piece. We do already offer automations in the network meta-analysis process. We also offer AI extraction that is powered by GPT 3.5 and 4 for those research designs that I mentioned. So things like targeted literature review, or gap analysis, scoping review, horizon analysis, really great applications that have been used by academics, by industry, and you can give it a try yourself. If you're interested, we offer a free trial period here at Nested Knowledge, and the team would love to meet you or your research team and get you started on that trial basis.
Yeah, and I'll leave the link in the description box under the episode. So if anybody wants to reach out to you, they have access to that. And I'll also include, Kathryn, the article or the blog post that you wrote on the patient-centered HTA. And so thank you so much, both of you. I feel like we're going to have a lot more discussions on this topic. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned for our upcoming webinar as well, Sabrina. I believe we'll be hosting a webinar on LinkedIn as well. So we'll see you back on there for that one.
Yeah. I'll include the details for that too. I believe it's going to be on the 26th, I think.
Okay, fantastic.
All right. Thank you.